Hi, and welcome again to Ivy English. I'm Karen.
And I'm Chris Gorski.
Today is November 8th, and we're on page 25 in your magazines. And today we're going to look at some rather surprising animal behavior.
Yeah, so today our title is African Buffalo, the Democratic Diners, and we're going to learn about how animals, at least one kind of animal, demonstrates a kind of voting behavior. But Karen, I have to confess, when I first saw the title, I read the Democratic Diners, and I literally thought it was about a kind of restaurant.
Yeah, that's right, because diner is also a restaurant, and it's often kind of a more casual place. Yeah. A greasy spoon sometimes.
And I'm from a city called Buffalo, and so just the language, the way it was tied up in my brain, I was like, what is this about?
Is it political?
Yeah, I thought it was a weird political thing. And then I started reading and I said, oh, this is about the animal buffalo, not the city. And these democratic are not like politics. And these diners are not restaurants. These are animals that demonstrate voting behavior, which is really interesting.
So we are both native speakers. And Chris is also an English teacher. But when he read the title, he misinterpreted 3 words. But that doesn't mean, oh, your English is so poor, you misunderstood. No, he didn't have the context. So first of all, the most common context in which he hears buffalo is his hometown.
That's right.
Number 1. And number 2, there's an election coming up. And the first thing we think of is Republican and Democrat. So when we see Democratic, we think, these are the blues. Yeah, the liberals. And then when we see diners, in that context, we think it's a place to eat.
I grew up eating in a lot of diners. Just the way this title was written and my particular background, it just made this bizarre picture in my head that I couldn't make sense of until I started reading the article. Context really does matter.
So our title again is African Buffalo, the Democratic Diners. And here's our article. When a large group of people struggles to reach a consensus, voting is often used to help make a decision. Surprisingly, humans are not the only animals that exhibit this type of democratic tendency. Several different species of animals demonstrate similar voting behavior.
One of the most notable examples of animals engaging in this activity involves African buffalo. Ecologist Herbert Prinz first observed herds of African buffalo performing voting behavior in the 1990s. Groups of African buffalo would pause under the intense midday sun and rest until dusk. Prinz noticed that some buffalo would periodically stand up and gaze in certain directions during the break. As the sun set, they would proceed to a new grazing spot where they could feed during the evening. The buffalo's behavior is evidence of a form of democratic voting, as the evening grazing locations are selected in accordance with the most gazes from the group.
The African buffalo's voting system is straightforward. One buffalo initiates the process by getting up, looking intently in a particular direction, and lying back down. If other buffalo agree with this choice, they will mimic this behavior. Conversely, buffalo with a differing preference will face their desired location. Ultimately, the direction favored by the majority dictates where the herd will graze that evening.
Not all buffalo are involved in the decision-making process, though. It's primarily the adult females of the herd that participate. The voting system displays a certain level of fairness because the status of each buffalo in the group has no bearing on individual voting power. Every adult female, regardless of their social standing, has an equal voice. By exercising their collective wisdom through voting, African buffalo guarantee a full stomach for all.
That is very impressive, and I never knew that before.
I never knew this either. In fact, I had to dig up other examples and why scientists theorize that animals do this. I actually wrote Herbert Prinz an email asking some kind of more questions, and he's retired now, but apparently he still does answer emails.
Wow.
The university replied to me saying they'll forward this and he'll probably answer, but he may take time. He's a little bit older now, so hopefully we get answers, but unfortunately I won't be able to share them today.
That's the amazing thing about modern technology and email. You can just ask anybody. The time I really felt it was when I was doing translations. And in the past, you could only guess and you could maybe find no information on something. But now I just often write and ask the author what they meant.
That's right. I actually do this. Sometimes I translate menus or signs for companies, and there's context. In fact, I was having a discussion about the way old video games were translated into English and why there's this famous language of video games from the early 1980s. It's because there was no context of what was happening, and there was no way to contact the people, and just the ability to reach out and say, what does this mean? Now, unfortunately, we can't ask the buffalo themselves, but I have to say, from the manuscript that I read from Herbert Prinz, and hopefully someday I'll get an email from him, everything seemed to make sense to me. That does seem logical, and we'll discuss that a little later.
When we look at animals, we often base our judgments of their behavior on what we would do in certain situations. But often, animals have a totally different motivation, and it makes perfect sense in their own context.
I completely agree with this.
Okay, our title again, African Buffalo, the Democratic Diners. Democratic here is an adjective, so we stress both democratic and diners. The Democratic Diners. Don't say Democratic Diners. We wouldn't say that because it's not a noun. All right, and buffalo is both the singular and the plural. So, look, there's a buffalo over there. There are lots of buffalo. We don't add S to it normally. But now there is actually a tendency to add S to irregular plurals. More and more often, sheeps. I've heard that. Deers.
I've heard sheeps too. I still correct my students. I tell them not to say sheep. Sheeps. I tell them to say sheep. I was in the Buffalo Zoo this year, and they have bison, which are not actually buffalo. The city of Buffalo is not about the animal, but they point that out that we don't usually say buffaloes, E-S. So I think still officially, if you're of a certain age, we don't add the E-S. But maybe some younger people will increasingly do so.
It's changing because I've been following this. I've collected data. More and more of these irregular plurals are disappearing.
I wonder what people in Buffalo will say about this. This is interesting. Okay.
They may have an opinion on this. Our first paragraph. When a large group of people struggles to reach a consensus, voting is often used to help make a decision. That's a great opening sentence, and the word consensus is so useful. So we haven't reached a consensus yet. Let's discuss it some more.
I think consensus, a good synonym would be agreement, but I think it doesn't necessarily have to mean everybody's okay with every part of it, but it's good enough. We agree on enough that we can move forward.
That's right. It may satisfy nobody, but we can all accept it and move on. Okay, so it's a large group of people struggles to reach. That means they're arguing and they don't agree on a lot of things. But eventually, maybe they will come to an agreement through voting. So everybody will give their opinion and majority rules. Whoever gets the most votes will get their way. Surprisingly, humans are not the only animals that exhibit this type of democratic tendency. Now, this actually shouldn't be surprising because animals that move in packs generally have a leader, and they follow the leader. Or they have not decided on something. Maybe somebody else can sort of try to become a leader and lead people elsewhere. But we know that something is going on with animals, so we shouldn't be too surprised.
So a tendency is a habit. When I explain to my students the difference between humans and people, I always tell them, think of the difference between science and culture. In social studies class, we're talking about the history of our animals. And so we're going to call them people. But in science class, we're talking about our bodies, our blood, our organs. And this is the human animal.
When did you first find out that we're animals?
I was pretty aware of it as a kid. I was aware of it as a kid because I was looking at other animals. I was always interested in them. This idea struck me early. That doesn't mean I had some profound thought. I just thought about weird things as a kid.
I think I was past the age of 8, and we were discussing it at the table, and they said, humans and other animals. I said, humans and other animals? We're not animals. And then my sister and my father, my sister's older than me, they were just kind of laughing. They said, yes, we are. And I thought, no, we're people. It took me a long time to accept that. I thought, my God, we're animals. That was such a shock.
Like a mind-blowing moment,
Mind-blowing. Oh, my gosh. It was such a shock.
The magic is gone. There's no trade backs. There's no going back to thinking, no, this is not true.
You can try to deny it. It doesn't change anything. Okay, so people are not the only animals. We are included among animals, of course, who have this tendency to try and follow the majority. Several different species of animals demonstrate similar voting behavior. And when they call it voting behavior, then it's kind of shocking. My gosh, animals vote?
That really does sound weird. The way those are put together, animals and voting behavior, doesn't really seem to fit. It's kind of incongruous. But when we see what happens later on, you'll say, yeah, that is voting behavior. Please pay attention to the word species. There isn't a singular. We don't say a species. It's always plural.
That's another one. I have heard somebody say a species.
Oh, my goodness.
So what I'm telling you is that a lot of these irregular plurals are becoming regularized. You will see it. Google it. You'll find it.
I am always open. I'm always looking for it. I haven't personally come across this one, but I'll sure to be really sweaty when I do.
I've got it in my notes on my phone. I can show it to you. I'll do a search. I'm not trying to say it's right or it's a good choice. I'm just saying it started happening.
I actually point this out to my own students. You will see people be weird online with their language. Just be aware of that. Stick to the rules that you learn.
That's right, but it's also telling you that change is underway and that things are moving. All right, so different species use the same form, both for the singular and the plural, to be correct. It hasn't officially changed yet.
Okay, before we start paragraph 2, let's just very quickly compare two words. So the first word we're going to hear is gaze, G-A-Z-E, and this is to kind of lazily look off into the distance. It just means look. Then we have the word graze, G-R-A-Z-E, and this is to eat grass from a patch the way a cow, a sheep, or a horse would. Just pay attention to these words. They get a little messy in this paragraph. One of the most notable examples of animals engaging in this activity involve African buffalo. And of course, this activity is this voting behavior. Now, I'm not sure, Karen, how you feel about this, but I've always kind of thought as buffalo and kind of other grazing, herding animals as not especially smart creatures. So to think of them as creatures that exhibit voting behavior feels even more surprising on top of what we've already said.
Because it seems to be ascribing rational thought to buffalo.
Our next sentence, ecologist Herbert Prinz first observed herds of African buffalo performing voting behavior in the 1990s.
So that means back in the 1990s, which to me was like 10 years ago. It seems pretty recent to me.
It seems recent in my mind too, actually.
Yeah, there's this meme going around on the internet that 1990 was 10 years ago and 2000 was 10 years ago too. Okay, so back in the 1990s, this ecologist started noticing something about buffalo. You know, we just look at them, we just think it's animals kind of moving around and grazing and doing nothing special. But he saw a pattern.
That's right. And so, first of all, a herd is just a word for a group of buffalo, and his job was just to count the buffalo and what they were doing. He was carefully observing their behavior, and just through careful observation, he noticed that there was a certain pattern to the number of buffalo, the way they would stand, and then the way they would move. I think a lot of people would just see a buffalo stand up, look off into the distance for a while, then sit down, would ascribe nothing, assuming there's kind of nothing going on in this honestly dopey-looking animal's head.
Right.
And then there's this pattern that emerges.
That's right, because when we humans behave like that, we say we're staring into space, not thinking anything special.
This is a little bit magical, I have to say, for me, when we see what happens next here. So, groups of African buffalo would pause under the intense midday sun and rest until dusk. Okay, so it's right before nighttime. Everybody hangs out. It's really hot. No one wants to go anywhere. And the buffalo are like, okay, we're just going to sit down. So far, nothing too special.
And they don't have air conditioning.
Prinz noticed that some buffalo would periodically stand up and gaze in certain directions during the break.
If you only saw it once, you probably wouldn't think anything special, like Chris was saying earlier. But if you see that same behavior repeated over and over again, you might want to look more deeply into it.
As the sun set, they would proceed to a new grazing spot where they could feed during the evening.
So he saw two successive behaviors. Behavior A is some buffalo will stand up and they will look somewhere. And then behavior B is, well, the whole herd now starts moving to a certain place.
The buffalo's behavior is evidence of a form of democratic voting as the evening grazing locations are selected in accordance with the most gazes from the group.
So they're probably thinking, well, that looks pretty good over there. And the other ones think, yeah, but there aren't so many trees over there. There are more trees over here. It's going to be cooler and the grass looks much greener and taller and juicier.
So I opened Herbert Prinz's research on the internet. I didn't have to pay. It was just readily available. And I have to say, this was so impressive. So number one, the manuscript itself was rather lengthy, but it was rather easy to read. It was very quick reading until we got to the math section. And there were pages of math formulas for determining this voting behavior in buffalo and various other animals. I went from being like impressed, oh yeah, he noticed there's a pattern here, to like, wow, they figured out like not only overwhelmed because I definitely skipped the calculus, but I was like, man, they really sat down and crunched the numbers on how this would work. And it was just, I was already impressed with this, but I was just like taken to another level, seeing how, to what degree they were able to just sort this all out. I was just my mind was blowing.
So that actually brings us back to what scientific research is. It's something that is reproducible. You don't just observe it once. You observe it over and over and over again, and then you have numbers that prove that it is consistent.
So some of the questions I sent to Herbert Prinz was, what if there's a tie? If 10 look north and 10 look west, what happens? Again, he hasn't replied to me. I asked, is there a pattern to the voting? Are there favored directional patterns? Is this affected by rain? Do parents affect the voting patterns of their children? That this is something that happens with adults. You often closely model your political beliefs upon your parents. Not everyone, but many people do. Has he experienced evidence of this? And I really wish I knew.
Yeah, I hope we find out sometime. Let's move on to the next paragraph. The African buffalo's voting system is straightforward, as this sentence is. The sentence is very straightforward. And I also wanted to mention before we move on, Chris used the expression, crunch the numbers. That's a really popular phrase these days. So, for example, if you see an ad, it might say, well, we crunch the numbers and most of our customers prefer this over this. To crunch the numbers, that means that you just take a survey and you count and you compare. Okay, so if the voting system is straightforward, that means it is very easy to understand. Next sentence, one buffalo initiates the process by getting up, looking intently in a particular direction, and lying back down. So here is the procedure. When it's time to vote, one buffalo gets up. And then he looks in one certain direction. That is his favored place. This is the place he thinks we should all go to graze because it looks like the grass is really good there. And so after he's looked there for a while and hopefully everybody else has noticed where he's looking, he lies down again. On to the next sentence. If other buffalo agree with this choice, they will mimic this behavior. So this first buffalo initiates, which means to start, to put into motion a certain behavior. And then the other buffaloes see him do that and they think, yeah, that grass looks pretty juicy and good. They do exactly what that first buffalo does. Okay, the next sentence. Conversely, buffalo with a differing preference will face their desired location. So if there's another buffalo who thinks, that maybe looks okay, but I see one in the other direction that looks even better, he will repeat the behavior, but he will look in the direction that he favors.
Now, there's a question. There's a question that comes up after this next sentence.
Ultimately, the direction favored by the majority dictates where the herd will graze that evening. So I guess everybody who wants to express an opinion gets up and looks in their preferred direction. They have to know how to count.
This is exactly it. Do buffalo have some kind of counting system? What is it in their head that informs the others that, hey, 15 look that way and 10 look this way? How do they discern that? There's another layer to this that we have not yet gotten to. This is really just outstanding research.
Just guessing, I'm thinking whatever looks like the biggest area. So the buffalo that agree with this one, they form a large circle. And the ones who disagree and want something else, it looks like a smaller circle or oval or whatever. I'm thinking maybe that's a possibility.
So before we begin our final paragraph here, just very quickly, why might this appear in animals? So one survival instinct among some animals is to live in packs. Packs offer protection to the weakest, the youngest, and the oldest members of a pack, among some other benefits.
And it provides leadership.
We can consider a group of primates deciding where to travel next, a flock of birds deciding when to leave a foraging patch, or maybe bees choosing their next nesting site. Unless all these members decide to go in the same direction, some will be left behind, and now your advantages of group living are lost. And so this democratic voting behavior ensures social cohesion and ensures the safety of the pack.
And that is very important. We have one paragraph left.
Not all buffalo are involved in the decision-making process, though.
So that means that some buffalo maybe don't express an opinion.
It's primarily the adult females of the herd that participate. Now, Karen in the last paragraph was saying he. Now, of course, these are it animals, right? We just use this he and she in English as just a convenient way of ascribing like and a buffalo.
But usually we want to know the gender because we need to use his and her when we're speaking about them.
But just to be clear here, these are the females largely doing this. What are the males doing? I don't know.
I know a lot of cultures like that.
Yeah, the men are just sitting back.
I visited one actually a couple summers. So anyway, it's kind of surprising. It's the females that get most involved in this process.
The voting system displays a certain level of fairness because the status of each buffalo in the group has no bearing on individual voting power.
Which basically says everybody's vote counts and they all count equally.
Be careful. Don't say hasn't, no bearing. That's wrong. It has to be has affirmative, no negative. Every adult female, regardless of their social standing, has an equal voice. And so even the leader has just one vote, just like in democratic countries. By exercising their collective wisdom through voting, African buffalo guarantee a full stomach for all.
Which is a very nice ending. I just really enjoyed this article. I thought, my goodness, I had no idea.
Yes, the collective is the power of working together.
Let's look at our questions. Number 1, what is the main purpose of the first paragraph?
And our answer is C, to let readers know democracy isn't limited to humans.
Which is a challenging new idea for me. Number 2,
what does the buffalo's behavior in the second paragraph refer to?
The answer is B, that buffalo rise and stare at specific points and then move to a new spot to graze. Question 3, according to the passage, why do African buffalo vote?
And the answer is D, to determine the location for their evening meal.
For the last question, you need to see a graphic, which you may not have in front of you, but the question is, which group of African buffalo is usually involved in the voting process? And the answer is adult female African buffalo. So the answer is letter B. Now, you can look it up online and you'll see what we're talking about here. That's it for today. Make sure you tune in next time. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.